okay, got a session with me. I'm going to tell you the truth. I will probably, you will discover what I'm going to say about the same time that I'm discovering what I'm going to say. But, you know, we'll see where we get to. So I think what I want to do, telling it like it is, confronting racism in the URC. Now, that title is there for a reason, which I'm not going to show you yet. But just a little bit of backdrop. I think earlier when I said that, okay, I'm going to take these off. These are my reading glasses, so you're out of focus. So. All right. I started in my post, actually, on the 1st of April 2020. And I insist that I know that God has got a great sense of humor, but sometimes the humor is at my expense, and I think this is one of those times. I found myself appointed in this post that I'm going to be very, very honest. I didn't envisage myself in, and I didn't really want to be in this post, but I was encouraged to apply for this post. And under duress, I applied, knowing that I'd be unsuccessful, and then I'd go and get on with my with my life. And much to my shock, and a little bit to my horror, I got appointed. And well, thank you. And started on the 1st of April. And I started right, near the beginning of the first lockdown, in the midst of COVID. And within a few days, really, of being appointed, my dad actually got ill and went into hospital. And long and short, we didn't see him again because my dad actually died of COVID. He went in. I was appointed first. My dad got sick on the 10th, and then it was about the 23rd that my dad died. And then within, I think, a couple of days, so almost as soon as I started, I was on compassionate leave while my dad was sick, and we were in battle with the hospital trying to get things sorted out, which didn't happen. But then, within a few days of coming back from compassionate leave, I can't remember whether I was still on compassionate leave, George Floyd was murdered. And so I got back in post. And, and of course, everybody was very supportive and very nice, and I appreciated it. And it was kind of, ease yourself in, Karen, ease yourself in, and, it'll be okay. And then it was, and George Floyd has just been murdered, and we need a URC response. Karen, will you draft it? And there was a bit of a shock to my system, because I've never been involved in that in this kind of work before. So I stand before you, certainly at that time, I stand before you not as an expert in transatlantic slavery, not as an expert in the legacies of transatlantic slavery. I stand before you as myself. You can see that I'm a black woman, and as I said, I was born in the UK. This is the context the only context I've ever known. And yet it's a context that has always somehow told me that I don't quite belong. So I will tell you, for example, that I am British. I will tell you that I am, typically I don't tell people that. If people want a descriptor, I will accept British, I'll accept Black British, I'll accept Black Caribbean. Those are descriptors that I will use. I will never call myself English, because something about this place, the only place that I've ever known, tells me you cannot be English because you are not white. That's all kind of backdrop. I told you I'd discover the same time that you discover what I'm going to say. Okay, so having then got into my post, into my role, I'm back from compassionate leave, and it's what do I do? And we're looking around, and as I said, George Floyd had just been murdered. So we wrote the URC, I drafted a statement. But then, so what? We've got to go beyond statements. So what? And it was a time when everybody's looking around, and as we've heard, it was, the re-emergence and so on of Black Lives Matter as a sentiment as well as a movement. And people were looking around and saying, do Black Lives Matter, but do Black Lives Matter. And the fury was out there. And so here in the URC, in my office, I actually said, but as we're looking around and as we're critiquing out there and as we're putting out our statements, do Black Lives Matter right here. So that was one of the first concrete pieces of work that we did, was to put together some online conversations exploring do Black Lives Matter in the URC. On the back of that kind of work, it's sort of the work has been, in a sense, almost dictating itself. And so on the back of that, Do Black Lives Matter in the URC, and hearing the voices from the URC, from the whole URC, as well as from black members in the URC, was then crafting what we would do next. So then we started to look at what does the picture tell us about whether Black Lives Matter in the URC? And we look at the picture and hear the testimonies of black people in our midst about what they experience in real life on the ground. You know, we say the URC is welcoming and it is open. And I'm not saying that it isn't welcoming and open, but it depends on what you mean by that and how far and to what extent and for whom and what does that look like, you know. So we're looking at those issues, and then we wonder for, and again, in building on the Do Black Lives Matter in the URC, we came up with the need for a resolution, or the need to, no, not the need for a resolution, the need to try to start initiating a culture change in our church, because the default, and what we want to believe the default is not necessarily the lived experience of our members. And so it was that we came up with the resolution, or the draft resolution in November 2020, which was looking at asking the URC to make a commitment to move from not racist to actively anti-racist. Because there is a difference. Because not racist lets George Floyd get murdered. Not racist lets Stephen Lawrence be murdered so many years ago, but that the focus is on what he did wrong and the police investigating him and so on, while his killers are walking free. Not racist is the default in which people experience all of these kinds of negative things, and people say, but we're not racist. But we're not racist. What are you talking about? So we need to be more than not racist. We need to be challenging and changing. And so it was that in November 2020, the URC did indeed adopt that resolution, and it was like, yes. But I'm going to tell you the truth. We were playing a little bit crafty. We deliberately worded it quite loosely, because we thought, actually, you need to, sometimes, the steps, where you need to get to, it's huge. But the steps, you need to step sometimes cleverly, and sometimes a bit lightly, and sometimes in small steps, and you've got to kind of, you know, suss your ground. And so we worded it so that it was kind of general, so that it was permissive. And we're saying, we will go where we need to go. And we've got the go-ahead. So therefore, now you've given us the go-ahead to go where we need to go. So now let's start putting the meat on it. And so it's that led to last year a commitment to, we called it affirmative action, to start trying to address the makeup of the URC, the senior leadership of the URC, that concrete stuff, to start to actually tackle it, you know, because you've already given us permission to go where we need to go. So that's the piece of work, a concrete piece of work that we're doing, as well as Legacies of Slavery work has been bubbling in the background, because I've been part of that work, as you've heard, since before I was appointed to this post. That's all kind of backdrop. In the time since I've been in post, I've had conversations with a number of people. A number of people have sought conversations with me, and amongst them is a group of our black ministers in particular. And they were, again, sharing their experiences, and they said, Karen, do they know? Does the URC actually know what we experience, what we go through? And I think, no, I said to them, no, I don't believe the URC does know. And how are we going to help the URC to know? So that, again, is informing the work that we're doing. So having said that as a backdrop, I'm going to share this poem, which is based on the conversations that I had with those ministers. And then you're going to see why it is that this session is called what it's called. Okay. So this poem is called Do They Know? Do they know, Karen, does the URC know all that we face day out and day in, what we see, what we hear, what we take in our stride, what it means, how it feels to walk in our skin? Can they imagine the sting standing fresh in the church, offering gifts of talents and time and much more, to be told you're not needed for this nor for that? We've called a white colleague we knew from before. Do they know how it burns when the message is shared? She says she's not coming on any such day that you lead, that you preach, because she insists she can't understand a word that you say. Do they have any idea just how much it smarts when a colleague in colour seeks to keep me in check, says, I welcome your folks in the pews but cannot accept a white collar around a black neck? When we look around and see so many ways we uphold this church, our church, across this land, then look beyond local, see our spaces dissolve, and hear the view that perhaps this is all as God planned. Do they know, Karen? Does the URC know just what we encounter while they say we belong? What it means to be black in this church, our church? Please hear what we see that something is wrong. I'll leave that bubbling with you, and I'll ask Rob to keep this with you. Since I've been in post, and I've been in post 2 years now, and right from the beginning, black and ethnic minority colleagues have been saying to me, Karen, does the URC actually understand, does the URC know what we go through?
And the fact that we are impacted by it, it means that something exists, right? And that something is racism.
If you have an image of a black Jesus, it's something that somebody will know that's not Jesus. Jesus should be white, should be perfect, should be like those images of a perfect Jesus that we see all the time. And that might not strike the right chords to a black person who has not seen any good from white people who are oppressing them.
My name is Lindsay. I'm a member of the United Reformed Church here in the UK. Like many of you watching, I never considered myself racist. As a trainee teacher 30 years ago, I was taught to be colourblind in the classroom. But that approach failed to acknowledge that society isn't colourblind. Our institutions aren't colourblind. Our church isn't colourblind. When this anti-racist conversation began in the United Reformed Church in around 2018, I, like many of you, wasn't aware of the need for it. I hadn't heard the need. I hadn't seen the need. And that's because I wasn't listening to the voices that were crying out for it.
Since I've been in post, and I've been in post 2 years now, and right from the beginning, black and ethnic minority colleagues have been saying to me, Karen, does the URC actually understand, does the URC know what we go through?
Karen Campbell is Secretary for Global and Intercultural Ministries. Her love for poetry is a source of inspiration on her journey towards racial justice in the UK.
Because they've been sharing their experiences with me, sometimes often really painful experiences. And I say the URC, I don't think the URC does know, because we pride ourselves on being open, on being inclusive, on embracing everyone. But that doesn't necessarily reflect people's lived experiences.
I was talking to somebody in my community that I work now about the footballers, kneeling down against racism in football.
England's players were racially abused during their 4-0 win over Hungary in European World Cup qualifying at the Puskás Arena. Monkey chants were aimed at players on different...
Andrew Mudurara serves as a URC minister in the Midlands and finds evidence of racism not only in government policies but also in church life here in the UK.
And I was so surprised to think that somebody's complaining about people challenging injustice and racism. But this is a thing that I live with each and every day of my life. It's almost like normal for me to hear, walking in the park even now, hearing teenagers, especially on a Saturday, making monkey sounds when I'm passing.
Well, it's a facet of white supremacy. It's something that it can be very insidious in the UK. And another way is very obvious as well, because I think people like to ignore it. So they will brush it off as a joke or say, I didn't mean it like that, or I'm not one of those. But they'll end up making very ignorant comments. And if you call it out because of, keeping the stiff upper lip, you as a black person or as a person of colour would feel that you are wrong for calling out and, kind of mess with the vibes of the room that you're in, especially when you move into more white spaces, as you find you have to do as you progress in your professional educational career.
Philippa, like many young black people in the UK, is deeply aware of how unequal society really is.
Now it's clear to me we miscommunicated. You equivocated. You've already moved on, I'm alone and so damn jaded.
I was approached by a kind of random man to ask about the Black Lives Matter movement and whether my friend and I agreed with it. I, as a singular person, am not the representative of Black Lives Matter as an organisation or as a movement. Neither am I the representative of black people in general. It was a very odd experience, and I left feeling exhausted and drained, and like the rest of the day was kind of ruined because of that experience. I think he also mentioned that he, as a white working class man, experienced more discrimination from middle class white people than I did as a black woman who also comes from a working class background, because we achieved some sort of privilege on the virtue of us being a token black person in a white middle class space, and eventually just had to end the conversation because it was exhausting and just wanted it to end.
Like many of you, I am mortified by what I've learnt over the last 2 to 3 years. The church has too often disregarded the voices crying out in the desert.
I'm a Christian, and I don't believe it's right for someone to steal.
It will be maybe lying to ourselves and working very hard to believe our lie that it's not existing. I think we all know that racism is a creature that has been there for a very long time, and it's going to take a lot of effort, like we are doing as a denomination, to root it out. But it is there, and it manifests itself in many different ways that are very subtle, but it is very noticeable to the recipient.
They don't want me, or nobody like me.
Wilbert Salimani was the first black clerk of assembly in the Uniting Presbyterian Church in southern Africa. He went on to serve as moderator of the Presbytery of Zimbabwe.
So I take
One of the benefits of having served in a global South Partner denomination is the wider perspective it offers.
from those who can't afford to lose. lose their necklaces and rings.
Wilbert is deeply aware of the racial imbalances in the URC structures.
I just look my options through.
Wilbert wants to see the URC embark on a determined process of affirmative action by which black members are appointed to leadership, taking into account a long history of white privilege.
Well, having come from a very different context into this one that is predominantly white, it is obvious that we would find the structures very white as such. But being a church that's actually singing a song of wanting to prove to the world that racism is not there, or we don't tolerate or accept it, it should actually show in its structures from top to bottom. And there I would give examples of the General Assembly structures, Synod structures, and maybe many other committees. I think there should be a deliberate effort to let them be seen as multi-racial or cultural.
When we talk about white privilege, we're not talking about being better off or having special treatment. We're talking about the undetectable privilege of not having to face daily microaggressions and judgments based on our ethnicity. Assumptions that people make about where you come from, or how you behave, or what you think. We don't often see outright racist hatred in church. It's more insidious.
I've heard reflections from ministers who say that white ministerial colleagues have come and visited them, seen them, and actually verbalized, I can accept black people in my congregation. I don't accept black people wearing a white collar.
The denomination is not without its problems to do with racism. There are people who would say that racism does not exist.
Reverend Dr. Tessa Henry Robinson describes herself as a womanist theologian who is committed to seeking justice for minoritized and marginalized groups, particularly women.
And this is a difficult place and a difficult thing to hear, especially when every day the color of your skin when you are not white matters.
When I came into the UK, I wasn't psychologically prepared because there is an assumption out there in the world that the United Kingdom is so civilized, people know this. So I wasn't psychologically prepared for what I would have faced.
Right, because I'm a black woman, and how we have a 5 times higher rate of mortality after childbirth, how we are less likely to be referred on to specialists, because they don't seem to take our problems as seriously, because we are deemed to have a higher pain threshold.
The language, some of the racist language, I didn't know them. I only started to know them when I came here, to know what that means.
Which is a lot of the reason why we are not prescribed adequate pain medication, are not prescribed adequate medication, full stop.
I hear from colleagues who arrive in the local pastorate and are told that this member or that member is not coming, has openly said, I'm not going to come when that minister is preaching. I don't understand their accent. I don't know what they're saying. I think what it really amounts to is, I don't accept their ministry.
Well, power dynamics are always there, and the ones that I have experienced myself, especially in this context where I am now, are such that you would have someone confronting you over things that he is alleging that you don't know simply because you are black.
Sarcastic questions being asked to me to say, when did you learn how to drive? As with the assumption that almost thinks that people only drive in the UK, and I would sarcastically respond sometimes to say, no, I learned how to drive by riding a giraffe.
A lot of colleagues, both black colleagues and white colleagues, have shared with me that they are tired. They're tired of the day in, day out struggle. They're not tired of the URC. They're not tired of ministry. They're not tired of Christianity, but they're tired of the struggle. Why have we not arrived as yet?
But things are changing. Together we can listen and we can act.
Right, let me just get my brain in there. There are very many people in the URC who are absolutely committed to the journey for racial justice, both black people and white people.
I have a lot of hope for the future because, our work is based off of Jesus, and I think that he was an advocate of justice.
By the nations looking at you, they will see and desire to serve a God that you are serving. And that is the calling of the church, to be a blessing, to be a role model, to fight and advocate for equality.
Life flourishing communities. I am so hopeful when I hear those words together.
Well, all I can say is to thank you for even asking me about these questions and sharing this kind of stories. I think they are important, so that if the wider church understands that racism is still there and they hear it from the stories that are being told, it will help the efforts that I've just commended. Those efforts will be assisted because we will see how far we need to go, how much we must do to ensure that racism is not part of our denomination.
That video was it was born from the conversations with those ministers. No worries. It was born from the conversation with those ministers. Part of the how do we enable, how do we help the URC to become more aware. So this has been created as a resource because there was an idea about can we have space at General Assembly, but I'm very conscious that General Assembly is a very limited space and often very disconnected in real life from local churches and so on. So this has been created as a resource to be offered that people can, watch it locally and hopefully have conversations and think about the issues. So I don't know. I'm hoping that some of what I've said so far, some of maybe in this session or even earlier, as well as what you've seen in the video, might spark questions, comments, and so on. But I'm just going to say a few more bits, and then I'm going to throw it over to you, if that's okay. So I think the first thing I want to say, I just want to flag up some of the areas of work that are going on, which I've kind of probably mentioned, but I know that sometimes, because I'm speaking off the cuff and I could be a bit whistle-stop. So there is what was known as the affirmative action work, which General Assembly last year gave the go-ahead for the setting up of a group to look at affirmative action, specifically to look at can we come up with a policy, a way of working that will definitely address this out of balance picture where black and ethnic minority people are not in positions of senior leadership and influence in our church. I'm smiling because I'm going to say, I'm about to be tongue-in-cheek, I was corrected because I was told, we're the URC, we are a conciliar church, we don't have senior leadership. And I thought, yeah, okay. But we all know what I'm talking about. So that task group was put together. It is a mixed task group. Andrew, who you saw, who gave us all a chuckle, telling us about riding giraffes. Andrew is part of that task group, and it's a deliberately mixed task group, and has been looking at this issue. We have discovered that in the UK there is no such thing as affirmative action. It is positive action in the UK, and we've also discovered that there cannot be a policy of positive action. But we are not seeing that as being that there is no work to be done. We are seeing things, for example, whereby positive action does allow you to maybe think about how and where you advertise the roles that do come up. You know, what kind of wording you use to specifically attract certain underrepresented groups. Incentives that maybe particular training and so on that can be offered to specific groups. And also, positive action does allow that for certain groups of people who have special characteristics, that if they're underrepresented in a particular area, that if such a person is in the running for a role along with somebody else, okay, let me start that again. You cannot have preferential treatment as such. So you can exercise positive action, but the two candidates, they must be equally qualified. Okay. And what we are arguing, what we are suggesting, we're not arguing, what we're suggesting is that in terms of us trying to redress the balance, if we take it that equally qualified means that if a URC post is advertised as needing, the candidates need to have 1 degree, and then we have applicants where a white candidate might have 6 degrees and a black candidate has 1 degree, we don't automatically say that the white candidate is more qualified because what was being asked was 1 degree. Because we're quite conscious of the backdrop that there are people who have been excluded from some of our the routes by which you would get all these qualifications. So it shouldn't be about the whistling and banging CV, but actually, is this the right person for this role? And that's what we're trying to emphasize and suggest. And we're suggesting, for example, that there should be anti-racism training across the board, pretty much for all assembly committees and so on, all church house staff, including the general secretariat, because sometimes in these issues, it's easy, for example, I'll pick on my own committee. It would be easy, for example, for mission committee to say, everybody in education and learning should undergo this training, or everybody over there should undergo that training. We're saying everybody should undergo this training, and that this should be cascaded, and that we need to be asking the resource centres for learning to also look at that and to build in anti-racism training throughout the curriculum when somebody comes into college and they're training for ministry, so they don't reach the end of their training and then start thinking, now what do I do to make this be anti-racist? But it's actually default way of thinking, just our default way of being. So that's the kind of thing that we're working towards. And we're also working towards a conference which is planned for next year, bringing together some of our existing senior leaders with black and ethnic minority colleagues, both lay and ordained, for cross-listening cross-fertilization, so that we can hear the issues and hear it firsthand, and so that people, and also so that people can start to have their profiles, some of our black and ethnic minority people can have their profiles raised.
I recommend it to you. And in the same way, and it's not because I don't think that white people are good, or I don't think that somebody else is good, it's because these are the people that I know. And so in the same way, with our system of nominations, the people who are nominated were like the people who nominated them, and then they nominate people who are like them as well. So the system just keeps replicating itself. So I say we need to cut through the system. We need to cut through it and do something else. So that's what we're trying to do, is to raise the profile so that people can see who is out there, and so that we can start to cut through the system and nominate different people and bring them up. So that's one area of work that's going on. Then there's the legacies of transatlantic slavery, which, as I said earlier, General Assembly this year did adopt the statement of confession and apology. And in a sense, it's and now what? So that is my next piece of work, is the and now what? And we're thinking about what to do next. And the film you've just seen is part of the what next we're thinking and suggesting, that maybe to offer that to synods as discussion point, as enabling conversations and so on. Have a few little tricks up the sleeve, but haven't aired it out yet, so yeah. But also, there's the issue of the reparations or repairing justice. And so what we're doing at General Assembly this year was getting pretty much the promise that this is going to happen. And now, next year, we should be bringing back the concrete proposals of this is what we're suggesting, so which of these is the concrete things that will be happening, And my viewpoint is, it's not only about money, but it is about money as well. Because not least, let us remember that when slavery was abolished, and the people who saw themselves as owning slaves, I'm really reluctant to say slave owners, because it's people, it's not slaves, it's people. And people, some people took it upon themselves to think that they had the right to own other people. Anyway, the former owners of the enslaved people were compensated. And that huge compensation package was paid for, at the expense of taxpayers, and was only finished paying for in 2015. And so all of you, pretty much, have contributed to that bill. I have contributed to it, and I think that's outrageous. I've been paying a bill to pay off people who enslaved my ancestors. It's outrageous. So it is about money, and it's money that keeps so many parts of the world in debt, which then keeps so many parts of the world, in a sense, we try to maintain, so indebted and reliant on this part, so that we look down on some and we look up to some and all of that. So it is about money, but it's not just money. So we're looking at what can we do, what action. Some of it is about education, and that continuing engagement with white privilege is part of what we're suggesting under this heading as well. And then the other thing that's happening is a lot of engagement in ecumenical spaces to see what our neighbouring churches and parachurch groups are doing, and making sure that we are part of the mix and involved in what's going on. So, so for example, in one of those things is that next year actually marks the 30th anniversary of the murder of Stephen Lawrence. And so one of the bits of work that is currently ongoing is creating Racial Justice Sunday materials. Racial Justice Sunday being in February. And it's proposed that next year it will have a Stephen Lawrence focus in different ways. And so we're part of that conversation, that journey to create that resource, and not only Racial Justice Sunday resource, but other events and initiatives through the year to mark, this terrible anniversary, actually. So there's work going on. I won't go into all of it because I'm looking at the clock as well, and I want you to throw things at, no, don't literally throw things at me. I'm being a bit arthritic, I'm not good at dodging. So, yeah. Any questions, any comments, anything?